The Marching Roundtable is proud to be an official media partner of Drum Corps International.
Thanks for coming to the Marching Roundtable YouTube channel, sharing great information to help you succeed in all the marching arts. While you're here, we hope you'll subscribe.
Nobody wants to get on the field and do something not to the best of their ability. So creating a show in which every performer on the field can feel successful is extremely important. And so a lot of times I know that this is kind of a hard area for directors, because we never want to pull a student or pull performers from specific parts. But keeping in mind that we want to make a show in which every performer is able to contribute in the way that they can make the most effect for the show. So when you're doing this in a winter guard standpoint, it's extremely important to keep that in mind. And oftentimes, you know, those support performers, or maybe they're playing a dancing role or a theatric role. Those performers are just as important as that, maybe it's a solo performer who's doing a two-turn. But the one thing that I always like to tell new directors or directors who are programming for the very first time is pick something that you know that your performers can achieve and can achieve at a high level, and they will feel success and connection to that program. It's extremely important. Nobody wants to go out there and be bad at something. And, oftentimes I feel, I actually feel extremely sad when I watch performers who are maybe given a show that's too hard for them, and you can see the defeat even just watching them perform. And that is absolutely the worst feeling. And so you want your performers to be successful. And so coming up with ways to hide areas that they're just not at a performance level yet. You don't have to be anybody else when you program your show. And I think that's another really important note, is you get to be you get to be your program, you get to create a creative identity, and you get to do that by making sure that you're programming smart and using your strengths, using your weaknesses to be a strength, and then also just programming elements of your show that work in a cohesive way that are visually appealing.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Hinton, the Beast of the Marching Arts. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I'm here with Jessica Glasgow. Jessica, how are you?
I'm doing so great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I had a hard time getting that out, but I'm so glad that you're here. I'm sure everybody knows who you are, but just in case, why don't you just sort of say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jessica Glasgow, and I'm a program coordinator or artistic director in the activity of marching arts. I've been doing it since I basically graduated high school, so a long time, and I enjoy just working with programs of all sizes. And currently I am the artistic director at American Fork High School and a few other high schools as well. So.
Well, it's awesome. Thank you for being here to talk about this. Everybody, this is such a great topic. Okay, we're talking about how to program for your group's strengths, right? Your band strengths, your winter guard strengths, whatever your performing arts group is. And Jessica, I think this is like the most important thing. I mean, I feel like when I'm designing, this is the place you start, is how can I highlight anything that they have that's special and wonderful and put it out there and make the most of it. And then of course you're going to hide all the weaknesses and things that they aren't good at. But I feel like this is where I start when I'm thinking about designing.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is quite often the very first place that I start as well. And I think that this conversation can happen as early as you're done with your previous season, and being able to look at all of the different elements that you have and your resources and your membership, and really program a show that best showcases you, your program, your vision, your goals. And we're going to talk a lot about different elements that I consider when I'm programming, but it's so important to set your program up for success. And the best way to do that is to give them, I always say a vehicle, it's kind of my terminology, but to give them a vehicle that they can drive, right? And they can make it all the way to the end and be successful. And a lot of times we might think of all these different things that, we see a group out there and they have these huge props or they have this big set design, and we're envious of that, but we also have to look at that from a standpoint of what's realistic for my performers and what's realistic for my resources, and even sometimes community. we can talk a little bit more about that as well, but that's something that has to be considered, you know, how the audience is going to perceive this production, and that's something that we should be considering. Or what venues are you going to be in? You maybe don't always program for your spaces, but it's super important to think about, like, what venue is that final show in, and what do you want that to look like in that venue? And a lot of times I think that it's hard because you get to the end show and you realize there's a huge retainer wall at the stadium and everything you programmed is in the front of the field, and all of a sudden the front of the field becomes less visually impactful, right? So being able to program for your space. So we'll kind of touch all the different places to start, things to consider, and really just how to get started with making good decisions for your next season.
I love it. So everybody, Jessica's super organized. We have a PDF that will be flashing on the screen. So if you're listening to this instead of watching it, by all means, you can find the recording of the video version of this on our website, and we encourage you to do that. So Jessica, I'm just going to let you jump in. I am going to pop in and give you my 2 cents worth from time to time, but I'll let you start.
Yeah. So we're going to be starting just at the very, very beginning of where, you know, kind of the myth of creating a show. And one of the things that I always often hear is that creativity is really kind of what we all strive for, right? We want to create something that's never been seen before, never been done before, which is absolutely fantastic, but also being able to look at that from a programming standpoint is extremely important. So effective programming and the reality of this myth, right? So a band's success depends solely on their creative ideas. And while that is extremely important, and creativity is a huge part of our activity, and honestly, it's what I love the most, it's also hard because you have to make sure that creativity is also paired with a few other things. And so we talk about practicality, like are we able to do the show that's given? So not only from a performer's aspect, meaning are the performers set up for success musically and visually, but in addition to that, are we set up for success with props and transportation and budget and so many different aspects of programming a show is incredibly important. And on top of, do you have the right staff put in place to make that happen? A lot of times when we are programming a show, I always consider the staff that's going to be there full time and what their level of expertise is. You know, if you have a color guard coach and their background is dance, that should be something that you're playing to. And then just strategic decision making. So oftentimes, and we're going to talk about this in very specific terminology, but looking at different strengths and weaknesses of your program and how you can actually play to that and program it. I always say that you want to make sure that the things you do really well, you highlight. That has to be like that main moment. That has to be, you know, one of those 8 huge impactful events that happen throughout your production. And then things that you maybe are we'll say less great at or weaker at, you want to make sure that those are things that are hidden. And sometimes it becomes really fun, and you can come up with a creative way to hide these weaknesses that can almost make a weakness a strength. So for example, and I feel very confident sharing this, but I have a program that actually in one of their limitations is rehearsal time. So it is a program that is in Iowa, and so they do not have a lot of rehearsal time. They have some facilities limitation, meaning that they don't have a full field that they're able to practice on. And so when we're programming their production, one of their things that we want to make sure is that they don't have a lot of time to perfect this. So whatever we give them on day one has to be successful. And that means that we don't spend a lot of time on marching basics. And so one of the things that we have to hide is the fact that we are going to use more pedestrian type show ideas with this program, because we want to use that as a way to hide maybe a weakness, right? So marching maybe isn't their strength, but we can play to that and we can actually use that in the show design as a strength.
I mean, that's a great example. I had someone hire me this year to write a drill, and I felt like this director chose music that was much, much too hard for his students. He got very excited about this certain show that this person found. And so I, as a drill designer, had to come up with all these ways to have them run around and spend time without marching, because it was like, 180 beats a minute for like 3 minutes. I'm like, this can't happen. Another thing that you mentioned about finding those what the strengths are of the band. A lot of times when I'm working with a program for the first time, sometimes it's a very small group. Like I've worked with bands with like 30, 40 kids, right? And so, they might have a good trumpet player, and that's certainly a strength that we know that we have for a soloist. But sometimes I will say, listen, you need to go have surveys with your kids and find out what can they do, right? Is there that flute girl that happens to have 5 years of dance training? Okay, she's getting a dance solo in the middle of the ballad. Why not? There's a kid that can juggle. There's a kid that has martial arts training. Find out what they can do, and then I'm like, it's going in the show. If I'm able to write a show for them, or at least help them to program it, we're going to figure that out. You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes it's down to this specific kid, and you don't even know that clarinet player sitting back there has that skill. Wow, they can play piano like that, and I didn't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one of the things I wanted to touch on is another way to do that too is using your community as a resource. So doing a talent search within your community, or I guess at a high school level, you're looking at your high school program, but doing a talent search. So oftentimes programs that I work for will do like a talent search in November, and we'll do an audition, right? So we'll put it out, we'll put up flyers, and we'll set a date and time, and they come to the band room and they audition with their talent. And so when I go to program for this particular group, you might see a violin player, right? Or you might see, and we've used violins, we've used voice, that we had a singer-songwriter one year, and I'm looking for top talent. I'm looking for something that's sparks my creativity. And some years we don't use anybody, like every now and sometimes we'll get an amazing, juggler, right? For example, but I'm not able to find a way to use them in a creative way that makes sense. So I absolutely say when one of your strengths, especially at a high school level, is we have community. Maybe you have a robotics club and it's something that you want to partner with, or maybe you have, a creative art, club or something that you can use for resources. Maybe that's a prop design type. And in partnerships with other programs, they're always looking for ways to partner and be able to use their skills in real life situations. And marching band is real life, right? So
yeah,
I
love that. And it's not only, and I was talking about canvassing your own students, but also, who are their friends? Because maybe that clarinet player, her little sister can do this thing that she wants to be in the show. I have a show this year with some actors, and we needed a little kid. And somebody had a little kid, that they're in the show, like their little sister or somebody, or maybe that juggler that you need for your circus show is somebody's friend that's in the show, and they're willing, they're friend, they're band, they like their band friends, so they're going to come and be a part. You get the point.
Totally. Yeah, and I think, and so going into, we can talk a lot about strengths. So the next step of the process, and I always do this in November, but it can happen anytime before you're programming your show. This is an off-season conversation, but the very first place that you should start is a self-assessment of your program. When I'm working with programs, I often will have them rate their students and rate their sections against each other even. So, I want to see a full list of all of their sections, including the visual elements, color guard, percussion if they have dance team, and I want them to rank them, best all the way to the group that needs the most improvement. And then within that, I also want to know, like, is it a musical strength? Is it a visual strength? And really do a self-assessment on what you have and what you have with your program. And this definitely drives the visual aesthetic. So oftentimes, if somebody does have a program where they list their front ensemble as the very best section in their entire band, then there can be a way, like maybe you use that as an element of, that maybe they're staged on the field, or they come up with a way that becomes not only a musical element, but it can also become a visual element. And I've had that happen in the past where at American Fork in 2012, the best section that we ranked was our front ensemble. And so there was a reason why we had them staged on the field and in the way that we did. And that was because we wanted to highlight that section visually and also highlight that section musically. And we knew that when we programmed that show, that was going to be an element that we would use often. We would use it, on their own, and we would highlight it, and we would also use them as a full ensemble musical element as well. So really identify what sections are the best, identify, if you do have, maybe your flutes are rank visually the highest, identify why. Like, why are the flutes the highest, so that when you start programming, you can let your drill writer know, or whoever is helping you create this, that, if there is something that we can feature, that we're making sure that we're using that as a strength.
Yeah, this is the premise of this whole conversation tonight, everybody, right? That we're having right now. And Jessica, like, we're talking about it, and I'm like, well, this seems so obvious. Like, it seems like, of course, why wouldn't you do this? But I have to tell you, after all my years, people don't do this. Like, they don't think about programming their show this way. They think, I want to do this thing. And they don't think, okay, well, is that, all these things you just said, is it right for my kids? Do I have the people to do it in the right things? I don't think they start from this place. And I think they'd be much more successful if they did.
Yeah, well, and I also think it's interesting sometimes when people ask me about, okay, tell me, how did you come up with this show for this group? And oftentimes it comes down to, I have a list of creative things that I want to do and I love, and I play with them and I bank them and I put them in little folders, and but I'm waiting for a specific cast that meets that requirement for me to be able to use that production. And so oftentimes when people ask me, how did you come up with that? It really is very specific for that group of students. So when I first take a program or start as an artistic director or program coordinator, I have to find out what it is that is going to make this group successful. And we talk about community too. What is it that the students are going to, they don't always have to relate to it. Like, we don't always have to do things that the students think are trendy and cool, but how can we create something that they're excited about, right? And they can be excited about tons of different things. Trust me, I've gotten some students to be excited about artwork, right? Or whatever it is, but getting something that they can attach to, I think, is also important, and understanding, what's important to that program and that goal. And I had this happen actually, and I can use another example, and they wouldn't mind me using it, but I programmed for a school in Texas, and this is Channelview High School. And when we first sat down and had a conversation about what types of show they would like to program this year, it became very specific that they wanted to have a show that their students can connect to. And so when we picked their show, it was very specific for that group of students. And they were used to doing, I would say, a little bit more abstract or artistic type shows, which were successful for where they were at when they were at a specific place. But getting to the next level for them, they wanted something that the students could really grasp and they felt connected to. And I felt like that was an extremely important part of understanding, okay, so where is this community located? And that might seem funny to consider that when you're programming, but where are they located? What is their membership made of? What are things that this community might get excited about? What are holidays that they celebrate? What are holidays that they don't celebrate? But being able to find something where the students felt they felt connected to, they felt heard, and I love that about this particular element. So.
Yeah, that's really cool. It reminds me of my friend Michael James, who, of course, works with a lot of groups at a very high level. And I remember him telling me one time that he was working with a new school doing their Winter Guard program for the first time. And he says every time he went in and was working with them, and he would put on like this super high energy pop tune, like they just came alive, Yeah. And so he ended up doing that kind of tune for their show because he learned that they responded to that every single time. And I thought that was really cool. Sort of doing that assessment is super smart. And you have to know, I've had really smart band directors tell me before, well, I've had one tell me, I remember he said, well, this next year's group of seniors is like da-da-da-da-da-da. And so we need to do a show like da-da-da-da-da-da. And he was right. I mean, we programmed exactly for that sort of description of his top leadership students. And it was a huge success. So, you have to sometimes to teach the directors and staff that we're working with to figure out how to do this assessment. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and another resource that you have too is to ask the students. Now this is, sometimes people don't want to open this up because then you have to do it in a way where it is a suggestion and not that any of their suggestions will make it on the field. But I oftentimes will ask the students for musical ideas, right? Like we did this at Amador Valley this year, and actually one of our tunes, one of our pieces that we were actually using as a production element musically came from a student. And I think that that's a really cool element, is we already had a concept picked. We already kind of were, I would say, in the workshopping phase of what this would look like with Amador Valley. And we can talk about workshopping and how I do that. But it was interesting because we were able to share some preliminary design aesthetics with the students and ask them for some feedback and ask them and really what I was trying to gain is I wanted to find a piece of music that was popular in their community, that was something that fit a specific vibe. We were looking for something that was a little bit more electronic based, something that was fun. We were looking for this drove a specific color. And so we kind of shared this with the students and then got some feedback. And one of the pieces that we picked was from the students. And
Awesome.
It really is, yeah, it really is it's probably one of the favorite things that we programmed this year, so.
Yeah, and I've had schools before where we've decided, okay, we're doing music by this person or this group. Yes. And then we'll say, okay, students, band parents, community, everybody, tell me, what are your favorite songs by blah, blah, blah. And yep. They're not deciding, but having their input and letting them be excited about the process can be great. Okay, we can talk about each of these specific things for hours, but I feel like I need to get out of the way and let you keep going. What's next?
No, I'm totally fine. So talking next, so identifying strengths is super important. We could literally do an entire podcast on identifying strengths within your ensemble. But like I said, use your community, do the talent search, with your ensemble, do the talent search outside of your ensemble. It's crazy what you're going to find out about your students. And we live in a world where our students are incredibly talented. And so finding out what it is that is your strength. And then the next part of that is identifying weaknesses within your program. Acknowledge where your band needs improvement. And then in addition to that, how to address or hide those elements is going to be extremely important. So coming up with, and a lot of this is incorporated into ways that, maybe there aren't things that are within your control. So I did bring up, if you only have one rehearsal a week, and you only have half of a field, then you need to program a show that only uses half of the field and that is achievable, understanding that as a weakness. And then in addition to that, being able to know where your band needs improvement, and then what you can set goals for how to improve in specific areas, but make sure that it's achievable goals. So if movement is something that you struggle with, then picking a show that is, based on a movement element might be something that we would discourage, right? So being able to find out what those weaknesses are, and ultimately we want to hide those weaknesses. And sometimes, this is a little bit of a topic that can be hard when you're talking about developing performers. But I also like to say that nobody wants to get on the field and do something not to the best of their ability. So creating a show in which every performer on the field can feel successful is extremely important. And so a lot of times I know that this is kind of a hard area for directors, because we never want to pull a student or pull performers from specific parts. But keeping in mind that we want to make a show in which every performer is able to contribute and the way that they can make the most effect for the show. So when you're doing this in a winter guard standpoint, it's extremely important to keep that in mind. And oftentimes, those support performers, or maybe they're playing a dancing role or a theatric role. Those performers are just as important as that, maybe it's a solo performer who's doing a two-turn. But the one thing that I always like to tell new directors or directors who are programming for the very first time is pick something that that your performers can achieve and can achieve at a high level, and they will feel success and connection to that program. It's extremely important. Nobody wants to go out there and be bad at something. And, oftentimes I feel I actually feel extremely sad when I watch performers who are maybe given a show that's too hard for them, and you can see the defeat even just watching them perform, and that is absolutely the worst feeling. And so you want your performers to be successful, and so coming up with ways to hide areas that they're just not at a performance level yet.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm working with the program for the first time this year, and the guard instructor is really smart and savvy, and we have created a prop and set design on the field where some people can just step off stage, right? Which I think is really, really helpful in this day. And so there are certain times when here are my top 12 guard performers who are very kind of a lot of experience, and then these other new 5 guard performers are coming in and out of the show, and it's my job as a drill designer to bring them in and out without you even noticing necessarily that that's happening. But that's just smart writing. I mean, everybody doesn't have to do everything. You want to highlight and then let some people have some time to recover and come back in.
Yeah. Well, and the one thing that I think is really exciting about the way that our activity is going is we can also do this with wind performers, with percussion performers. And I think bands are a little bit afraid to do it just because there is still that mathematical element to drill, right? And so how do you pull somebody without dragging your eye in that direction? But oftentimes when you're programming and you're creating a show in which you can use that as a design element. So maybe the show is about New York City and there is a pedestrian moment and you are able to exit half of the woodwinds for a small period of time. And maybe they're not exit, maybe they play a prop role, or they have a secondary element that still keeps them, involved in the program, but doesn't have the demand of, marching a 7.5 minute show as a new freshman. Because some of our best students, you watch them the first season and it is hard. It's hard to watch them. You have to kind of balance, like how much can we push them, and grow them as a performer over we don't want to break them. And that's a really hard balance as a director. But ultimately, I think that the programming part of it is make smart decisions so that every performer feels successful.
Right, and the trick is that there are lots of ways to make this happen, everybody. There's lots and lots of ways to have someone not be as integral for part of the show. And it can be, as Jessica mentioned, something very thematic that makes sense to the person watching the show, right? And that's why you sometimes need to call somebody like Jessica and say, hey, can you help me? I'm planning my show and I'm trying to figure out this part, right? So Jessica, that's like one of the reasons why you call in people that have experience to help you win your programming.
Yeah, and if you do it right, it will impact your program in such a positive way, not only from the performer's experience, but also it just makes a really cool set, or it makes fun. Another example is for a winter guard show, and this was a junior guard that I taught. We did a show about being at a coffee shop, right? And so there was a really cool element where we could actually have, different tables with chairs, and there were performers who were interacting with each other at a coffee shop, right? And so while the show was going on, you still have this really cool, I would call it a secondary layer that's going on in the background, that honestly is just as interesting and effective and supports the main element. But those performers have such a great role, right? And then you can use them in those big moments, right? You can use them when you have the flag feature. You can use them in ways that they can still be a part of the full ensemble, but in a way that makes sense.
Gosh, what a fantastic example that is. I absolutely love that, because they're contributing to the show the entire time,
Yeah.
but in a way that's not as demanding from an equipment and expertise point of view. I love it. Okay, what's next?
Yeah, no worries. The last part is just talking about maintaining design integrity. And this is one of the things that I think is it's really hard when we first start, because the very first thing that you want to do is pick an entire show and you want everything ironed out from the very beginning, which is extremely important, but also making sure that we're not overcomplicating the design process. So a lot of times throughout, programming, one of the things that I see happen is that there is a concept and somebody owning this concept that's very well thought out. It has multiple layers, and it has maybe there's a storyline or there's a visual element that's driving this program, but nobody else gets it. And so sometimes that becomes actually a way that we can overcomplicate the design process. And I think that it's important to make sure that you're looking at all of the different things that make us successful. And I talked about this earlier, but looking at how is the community going to watch this, and how are your judges going to take this in, and what do you want them to walk away feeling? And if you look at it from that perspective, it really does help your design process. A lot of times we get very into our own personal feelings, or our own personal agenda, or our own personal aesthetic. And sometimes it's hard, because getting other eyes or getting other input is extremely important, because maybe the way that you intended that production to go isn't translating, or it is overcomplicated, and people don't get it. Not that every show is meant to be understood in the way that the designer intended it to be understood, but oftentimes, when I have conversations about, I watch a show and I sit down at a critique and have a conversation with the staff regarding their show, and it is about something completely opposite than what I thought, then there's a disconnect there. So there's a level of programming in which it's not being received the way that it was intended. So I think sometimes that can be a negative thing when we're programming as well.
Well, gosh, all right, everybody, I want you to rewind this tape about 3 minutes and listen to her say it again, because that is so important. Jessica, there's nothing more frustrating than sitting there and like, I have no idea what's going on and what this is about. And I feel you mentioned a fresh pair of eyes and ears. I say this all the time. I say it right now in marching season. I tell people, hire me or somebody else that has some experience to watch live or watch a video or something and just see what you're not seeing, because you know how it is. You're in the thick of it. You're sure it makes perfect sense to you and your staff. You've been living it. You're in the middle of it. But bring in somebody. I always tell people, bring in the lunch lady from your cafeteria and have her watch it. Does she understand it and enjoy it? And if she's like, well, I don't, what is going on over there? Then maybe you need to pay attention.
Yeah, and sometimes when I'm talking about overcomplicating too, like sometimes the process or the storyline, and I say get it, but you don't have to get all shows, right? Like some people will interpret
at the level of most of the people that we're talking to, I feel like it really needs to be pretty much understandable. If we're talking about world-class level at WGI, okay, that's a whole other thing. But most shows, I think they need to make sense. I need to understand it.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be something simple, right? It doesn't have to be like a storyline, right? Like your show could be about polka dots for all I care, but I want that to be something that I get when I leave, and when we're talking about overcomplicating too, the storyline, sometimes if they have so many different levels or facets of the story, it also can be hard to follow. So something that's extremely simple, somebody falls in love and then they don't, and then they end happy or whatever it is, like just make sure that the storyline is obvious, and make sure that storyline is clear, and that the performers also understand the storyline, because that's another thing is when programs are doing these very complicated storylines, and then they come into a critique and they tell you the storyline, and it's like, okay, didn't get one part of that storyline from watching the production, then obviously there's a programming problem there, right? There's a communication problem. So
yeah, all right. Well, just everybody take that into account and really do. And listen, Jessica, I would say this is true even before the show gets put on the field. When you're planning it, have somebody, everybody has that friend that has some experience they can trust, or come to me or Jessica or somebody, but somebody, and say, all right, here's what we're thinking. Gosh, Jessica, I've done this so many times with band programs where they will call me and say, okay, here's what we're thinking. We're planning to do this and this and this and this. What do you think? And I'll be like, oh man, I did that back in 1995, and there's a reason that you don't do it that way. Or, I did this thing one time where you don't have to build that whole prop. You can allude to it in this simpler way. Sometimes you can really save people a lot of trouble. So I think not only do you want people to watch the show while it's happening, but as you're planning it, throw the idea off somebody. What do you think? Is this going to work? Can my high school girls do this thing, or my members, whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. Use any resource. And I think that you mentioned it just a second ago, even, somebody in your community or a parent, or if you don't have, another friend in the activity, but really if you're able to explain the show element and they're able to watch it and they're able to gather or at least understand it in the sense that you intended it, then you're on the right track. But if there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of disconnect, then I would say that you're probably at the overcomplicating stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. Another part of just maintaining the design integrity is ensuring that all elements of the show work together. This is a big one. I have seen it so many times where if I'm judging or if I'm going in and doing a clinic with a program where there's some amazing things happening, whether it's a color guard element, a percussion, or a winds element, that are happening, but they're happening and they're in contrast with each other. So some examples of this might be you have this amazing musical flag phrase and it's happening on the opposite side of the field of the woodwinds. And maybe there's a rifle element that's written to a percussion element at the same time, and they're the ones that are around the woodwinds. And so that's one of those moments where it wasn't fully coordinated as an overall program. Whoever was choreographing it wasn't, maybe they didn't see the drill or they weren't tied into where those elements were happening on the field. Another example of this might be I've seen this happen too, where like there's a visual element where the winds are doing a ripple and they might be going from side 1 to side 2, and the color guard is doing a ripple as well and they're going from side 2 to side 1. Obviously the music called for some sort of a ripple element, and they were both on track by programming that, but as an overall program, we're missing some of those moments. And so making sure that when you're writing or you're programming as a staff, that you're involving all of those key players to make sure that every element understands what the goal of each section is and how to achieve that goal, so that we're not operating as 3 separate sections throughout your season.
That is fantastic advice. And everybody, this is not that hard. This is not that hard. Like, for example, Jessica, if I'm creating movement for a show and it's got a certain theme or whatever, concept or something, then you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have a conversation with the color guard staff, and I'm going to say, okay, like, how are you going to interpret this? What are you going to look like? Are you going to have a certain free arm for this Spanish show? Are you going to have certain poses or things? And then I'm going to use that same stance or pose or leg form or whatever and try to do that with the winds when I'm writing the movement for them. So that's not that complicated to just make sure that everybody's using the same basic ideas. And listen, the color guard people are masters at this stuff. So if they're always going to be doing this thing with their hand, well, then I'm going to figure out how to use that same motion. This kind of thing is so simple, but this is one of those basic things that people miss. They're like, why is this band getting all this? Why is their show working on all cylinders and mine is not? This is one of those things.
Yeah. And of course, and I love that cohesive element, and sometimes that you can use that as a through line, and you kind of explained it as maybe there's a pose that happens in multiple different areas, but it's all incorporated in the same way, right? And so the percussion can use it at a specific time, and the winds maybe it's a full program moment. And then in addition to the visual element of that too, there's a musical side of coordination and making sure all the elements work together. And that comes oftentimes too from even as specific as how you craft a specific phrase. So a lot of times band directors will want to work on musicality of a phrase, right? And they'll want to add some dynamics, or they'll want to add a forte piano crescendo, or they'll want to maybe have something crescendo and that wasn't written, right? So we often will shape phrases musically, and all of that is part of coordination, and all of that is part of programming too. And so when you're talking about programming, like anything dynamic level wise, like I always try to say that when we get to May, we need to have a pretty good idea of how each phrase is going to be crafted. And the reason why is because as we're choreographing the visual elements, all of that comes into play with how the color guard designers are choreographing those moments. And I've seen it happen before. I actually judged a group, and I specifically remember having a conversation and critique about an element where there was a very loud, very big band, very loud forte piano crescendo. And and obviously the color guard was up on an incorrect count, and we had a conversation. They were up when the band dropped, and it was extremely important for us to talk through how that happened. And from having a conversation in this critique session with the color guard and the band director, it was something that was added extremely last minute. And it was at a point where they couldn't go and just rewrite the color guard choreography. So it was an unfortunate event for this program, but by adding this forte piano crescendo, it really did mess up the visual side of this program. And so really everything has to be coordinated throughout all the elements and how they work together and how they support the overall show design. And it's one of those things that if you're adding things and you're not having those conversations with other key players within your organization, and maybe that's only 3 people, right? Maybe that's a band director, color guard director, percussion director. Maybe it is 2 people, or maybe it's a team of 10, whatever that is, having those regular coordination meetings or having conversations just to make sure that all the elements work together is extremely important when you're programming.
Yeah, I love that you just had that, just explain that all. That's another thing everybody to go back and listen to again, because that was so helpful. And Jessica, I think this is just something that band directors of programs that are growing and aspiring to be better and better, and that are on that, a lot of band directors, that they're taking their program up and they're like, okay, I need to know how am I going to get where I want to go? This is one of the key things, is realizing that this level of coordination, sometimes this is new and directors have to figure this out. I had a wonderful director that had a wonderful band. His band could play like crazy, but he had this thing where he never noticed the guard. You know what I mean? Like, he just was so listening to the music and paying attention to the winds. And sometimes I was saying something to him about the color guard, and he'd go, what? I didn't even see it. So this person needed to learn how to add that to their sort of field of view. That's just one example. But I feel like this idea of coordinating everything to this level, this is sort of like getting into the big leagues, everybody. This is sort of how you make sure, and you can get your whole team on board here. It doesn't have to all be my responsibility. Hey, my assistant director or my color guard, you got to always remind me, hey, let's check in on this with everybody. Somebody can be that reminder guy to help you make it work.
Yeah, and we've all been that color guard director that, well, some of us have been that color guard director that shows up for ensemble, and all of a sudden they, the winds have added 2 counts to a sustained note, right? So things that are extremely easy for, and I don't mean necessarily easy, but things that you don't think twice about, right? We're going to add 2 counts to that whole note. Everyone's going to hold for 6 and cut off here, and simple, right? We just want a little bit longer of a note. And we've all been that color guard director that walks into ensemble and you're in the middle of running a phrase, and then you're like, what just happened? And the color guard's like all looking at each other, and then the band director, that's a learning experience, or whoever is running that part of the program. But really, I could not say enough, making sure that all of the elements of the show work together. And it's one of those things that as you get to the end of your season, and I do this with all of my programs, it's extremely important to go back and debrief what you just did. Watch your show, watch it. I watch it in many different speeds. I know that might be weird, but being able to see how flow on the field is happening. How do you use your whole field if you are, or how are you using the part of the field that you programmed to use? But watching your show from a coordination standpoint and making notes, like, what do you wish going into next season, or goals were more coordinated as a full program? Where do you feel like the color guard maybe didn't match the musical phrasing of the winds? And then analyze, why did that happen, right? Like, did that happen because we added elements later on, or did that happen because whatever the reason is, being able to go back and look at your program and say, okay, why weren't these elements all coordinated together? Or what programming decisions could I have made that would better set my program up for success, I think is extremely important. And looking at it from a standpoint of, what are our goals for next season? You don't have to be anybody else when you program your show. And I think that's another really important note, is you get to be you get to be your program, you get to create a creative identity, and you get to do that by making sure that you're programming smart and using your strengths, using your weaknesses to be a strength, and then also just programming elements of your show that work in a cohesive way that are visually appealing.
Okay, I'm going to pop in. I have to say, I love that's such great advice. I want to highlight again that you said be who you are. And sometimes you have to figure that out, but don't try to copy this other group that you think is being successful. If you love what they're doing, then figure out your take on that, right? How does that fit your personality, your band, your resources, your situation, your students, all those things. Jessica, I had this wonderful conversation on a podcast with program coordinator Jody Rhodes, who does a great job, especially a lot of bands down in Texas. And she said she learned that don't try to be like everybody else. She said she learned this from her hairdresser. She said her hairdresser taught her she may have Jennifer Aniston's haircut, but she's not going to look like Jennifer Aniston. And I thought that was a really great lesson, because, you know, we all think, oh, I love what this group's doing, but they're successful because that is them and it fits their personality and their whole thing that we've been discussing. So figure out how to do your own take, figure out who you want your group to be, even if that's your group is different every year. You know, maybe that's your personality, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And pick that, I said this earlier, but pick that vehicle that's going to help drive your program to success, making sure that you have some sort of an element that, you know, and like I said, it could be polka dots for all we care, but making sure that there's some sort of element that's really easy to grasp that really helps drive your program forward. Maybe that's a musical element, maybe that's a visual element, whatever that is.
Yeah, I mean, I had a school this year and he said, our thing is we have great trumpets. So we need to do a Spanish, we're doing a Spanish show. I'm sorry, we're doing a Spanish show, everybody, because he had great trumpets. And we're like, okay, you know, not a huge band, great trumpets, we're doing a Spanish show. And it is rocking, everybody. It's going really well. The other thing, Jessica, that I'll mention is, I learned this from Michael Cesario, of course, one of the greatest coordinators and programmers of all time. And he said to me, you need to have a show concept that you can explain in like 3 words.
Yep.
Much less 1 sentence, but 3 words.
Yep.
You know, if you can't say this is what it is, our show is this, blah, 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 blah. So that's another challenge, is to figure out, that will help you from getting overcomplicated, which is one of the points you made, I think, really well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. 3 words or less. Tell us what it's about. I think that as you do that exercise too, I think that you'll learn a lot about your own design aesthetic too, because that will start to help drive what is visually appealing.
Yeah, so many things to consider. All right, so do we need to watch this last slide, or have you covered all that?
No, I think I pretty much covered.
Yeah, I think you got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean,
last one, like, I guess leaving room for your production to grow too. I just want to make sure that I touch on that point. And when you're programming for your group, making sure that you have a pretty good through line, I think, is important, but you don't have to have every single second of that production ironed out, and leaving room for that production to grow. There might be ways that as you're developing, or as you start to write with your drill designer, and as you start to develop musically, there you leave yourself some space or some creative freedom to workshop. What is this, and what is it going to look like? And I bring up workshopping often because when I first pick a show concept, and I think that it might be the right program for a group, I'll actually start putting together, you know, whether it's a field layout, or maybe it's some drill elements, or maybe it's actually looking at what are some of those areas that will kind of drive the show forward. But then it also leaves space for us to have conversations, or it leaves space for that production to change path. And don't be afraid that if something's not working, don't try to make it happen. Oftentimes, you know, you might change your mind, or you might find something that works better. And so it's okay to leave room for that production to come to life. You know, it doesn't have to always be the way that you had originally intended. And sometimes some of my best work comes from an idea that maybe isn't quite working. And maybe there's some issues with the way that it was programmed, and maybe there's something that we're having to go back and workshop, but we're doing this so early on in the process. This is, you know, springtime, right? But as you start to produce a production, leaving yourself that space to really let it come to life.
Yeah, I love that. I was working with a program this year, programming their show for this fall. And this is a group I've worked with for a really long time. And we had this idea that we thought was just so much fun. It was going to be such a hit or whatever. We spent a lot of time. We programmed it all out. I was starting to map out the drill in my head and what the arrangements were going to be. And then took the idea to somebody and said, okay, here, like, let's check in. Like, let's check in, what do you think? And like, it turned out to be a horrible idea. I mean, like, this person said, well, and I always want, I have that friend that will say this to you. Well, this is not meant to be a good idea. And that was a hard conversation to have because we had invested a lot in this, but ultimately this consultant, this friend, this person who helped us, who gave us their input, was absolutely right. It turned out that it was actually a terrible idea, and this person was able to enumerate all the reasons why it wasn't going to work. And so we shifted gears and ended up somewhere great now. It's a completely different idea, but sometimes you need to have that person that will say to you, I don't think that's a good idea, or let's talk about this part because this concerns me. Like, you need to have that person in your circle, and if you don't have them, then you hire Jessica, okay, or somebody else. There are a lot of people out here doing this because somebody that has some experience that can say, like I said before, oh, I tried that one time, and let me tell you why that's not a good idea. You need to have that person in your corner, somebody that can say that, or, all right, let's talk about this. Wait a minute, now, why is it orange? Are you sure it should be orange, and like, let's really talk about this.
Yeah, and allow yourself that space to mess up too. Like, don't be afraid to go back to the drawing board and say, this wasn't it.
This is a creative process. It's messy, really.
It really is. And I also think, I think it would be really interesting to do like a case study where we show, like, November to December to January to February, and how a show really forms, how many different titles sometimes we workshop, and how many, and then you get to the end product. And if you were to go back and look at where it was in December and what you started at, and then where you ended in November, if we're talking about marching band season, man, it's oftentimes very different. And so I think that that's a really cool aspect too, is just don't be afraid. If it's not working, if it's not working, it's not working, and start over. Try something new.
How many of the great artists, classical artists, have painted over? I mean, how many of their paintings are painted over something else, right? And like, this is just how it works. The creative process can be messy. And by the way, something you said in passing that I want to go back to as we're ending this conversation, plan ahead. Like, I feel like when you're in the middle of a season, a lot of times that's the good time to be thinking about the next year. Like, if you're in the middle of this year's marching season, your brain is in marching band mode, right? So let's start thinking about next year's marching band. Not that you have to figure it all out, but sometimes it's a lot easier to figure it out. And you're like, oh, wow, I'm looking at these kids, and this is what's really rocking this year. And look at all these juniors and blah, blah, blah. And you know what? This is the time to maybe start planning that. Whenever I've talked to Scott Chandler from the Blue Devils, he's planning a show 1 year, 2 year, 3 years in advance. Sometimes, like you said, he has shows in his pocket and he's waiting. He said to me, this turned out to be the right year to finally do this show that I've been wanting to do forever. That when he did that Tempest Blue, remember that just a couple of years ago? They did the show all about shades of blue. When I had the conversation with him, he said, oh, he had this idea for a long time. And they had talked about it multiple times, and then, this isn't the right group, right? So allow yourself that part of the process too. It's all really fun. It's fun to be creative and put shows together. And so there's a lot of tips that you've said tonight that I think are super helpful. But a lot of what we've said, my sort of takeaway is there's a lot of this, like, it's okay to check yourself, get feedback, see if it's the right thing. Like, there's a lot of checking in on, do I have the right kids for this? Do I have the right band parents for this? Do I have the right budget for this? Is this the right time? What will my community think? All these sort of checking in. I feel like sometimes band directors just get excited about a show and they haven't done this part.
Yeah, and it's okay too, because right now we're in the middle of marching band season. And so as you're heading to those critiques and you have opportunities to have conversations with, maybe it is a judging community or a clinician, it's okay to ask questions about future seasons too. It's okay to say, are we on the right track for where we want to go next year. You know, our goal next year is, you know, we want to go to a BOA regional, and we want to know that we're on the right track for programming for, you know, a BOA regional or whatever that is. Don't be afraid to ask those questions. Don't be afraid to, especially in like a clinic type situation, to get advice about where your program is at now and how to take those next steps to really grow it.
Yeah, and like what do you think we need to be focusing on? You know, oh, all right, so it's a movement thing. Oh, it's a marching basics thing. Oh, it's a tone color thing. Oh, it's a, you know, find out, get, like I said, fresh pair of eyes and ears. So important. Okay, so what would you want to say in closing as we're wrapping up this entire conversation?
I guess the biggest bit of information that I hope that you got from this is that anybody can program a very smart, effective marching band show. And so using your strengths and then also making sure that you hide some of the weaknesses of your program to really bring to life a concept that your performers, your community can get excited about is great. And that's where we should all be. And so using that as a clear vision to drive your show, I think is extremely important.
This was such great information, Jessica. I love that you're out here doing this work, helping bands figure themselves out, program their programs, put their programs together, grow their programs where they want to go. If somebody wants to get your help or has questions for you, wants to ask you a question or whatever, where would they reach you?
Yeah, you can actually go to my website and it has all my contact information. And so it's just jessicaglasgow.com.
All right, jessicaglasgow.com. Jessica, thank you for sharing your expertise with us tonight. This was great. I mean, this really practical, nuts and bolts, really helpful information. I hope everybody that's ever programming anything will watch this. Thank you for sharing this very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a good night.
Yeah, I loved it. Thanks. A great job.
Thanks.